I smell like burnt popcorn. Like really bad, I think. Hey everyone, Steve here, and yes, I did something really embarrassing today. I wanted some popcorn, so I went into the kitchen here at Knapp Street campus, and I almost burned the campus down. Okay, not really, but the first bag apparently was in a little bit too long, and I'm talking like smoke, like plumes of smoke coming out of this thing. I like run it out of the building to throw it in the dumpster so that nobody knows that I screwed up the first bag of popcorn, because who screws up bags of popcorn? Except everybody does. So what do I do now with this thing that happened? The Knapp Street campus kitchen smells like burnt popcorn, and so do I. And I've sent the facility staff into a frenzy thinking that the building was burning down. It's pretty embarrassing. So what am I gonna do with it? I'm deciding I'm going to use it. Embarrassment is an interesting thing, right? Psychologists will tell you that there's basically 6 types of embarrassment. Privacy violations, lack of knowledge or skill, when you should know how to make popcorn and you don't. Criticism and rejection, awkward things, body image, how you look, and environment. The word embarrassment comes from the Spanish embarazar, which kind of comes from a few different other languages, basically meaning to obstruct or to get in the way. What's interesting is that we have a physiological response to this kind of thing. And so like our faces get red, it gets really bad. That happens because the veins dilate in your face, and then it can rush more blood and oxygen up there and your face gets red. So not only are you feeling embarrassed about what has just happened, everybody around you knows that you feel embarrassed about what just happened. This is what is known as the fight or flight response. It's perfectly natural. It happens to everybody who is human, and it's also something that happens to us not just when we're embarrassed, but also when we are afraid. In fact, actually, this is really the only time it happens to us. So we know that embarrassment or self-focus like that is a fear response. It's about fear. Have you ever felt like this? Have you ever done something and thought, oh no, what's everybody gonna think of me? Or have you ever had something happen and you didn't really know kind of what to do with it and you were really afraid? These are the types of things that happen in our stories. See, one of the things that we do is we tend to overestimate what other people think of us. Like we think that they're thinking these terrible things about us. Or sometimes, on the other side of the spectrum, we think that they're thinking these amazing things about us. And sometimes we underestimate the other's thoughts and feelings toward us. We think, well, they didn't notice that at all, when really they did. See, we kind of bounce back and forth between those two things on the spectrum. What this does is this makes us really, really bad at figuring out where things fit in our story. Whether they're embarrassing things, or whether they're fearful things, or whether they're painful things, or things that we're just confused about, or even awesome things. The other thing that this does is it makes us really self-conscious. It makes us focused on ourselves, worried about how everybody else is seeing us. People aren't thinking about us as much as we think they are. Eleanor Roosevelt was really famous for saying, you wouldn't worry so much about what other people think of you when you realize how seldom they do. It makes us actually not that great at putting the puzzle pieces together and figuring out and making our story make sense. But this is exactly what our brains want to do when different things happen. We want to make the story make sense. Here's the issue. The story doesn't always make sense. In fact, most of the time, it's not going to make sense, because for us, a timeline is very fixed. It's birth and then death and everything in between. And that is actually too short a time period to really make the most sense of the things that go on in our lives. So what do we do with this? So there's a character in Scripture that finds himself in this position, and what God does with him is something that we really need to focus on and learn from. This comes from Exodus chapter 3, and what we have is Moses, who is being called to do a job that is way bigger than what he is actually qualified to do himself. So God is speaking to Moses, and he's saying, hey, Moses, you go and speak to Pharaoh and convince him to let all of my people go. That is a massive, massive job. And we see what Moses says in chapter 3, verse 11. But Moses says to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Perfectly natural response, right? This is Moses being a human. He's looking at the job ahead of him and he's going, man, this is so huge. And he's getting really, really focused on himself. And he's looking at something that's about to be a part of his story and he has no idea how to make sense of it, where to fit it in, how it even fits, if it fits. This is what's happening in his mind, which is leading him to say, "Who am I?" I think a lot of us, if we're honest, find ourselves in this position. I think that there are so many people who go through life, and whether it's because embarrassing stuff has happened to them or because they're just kind of not sure of themselves, or they've got a big job ahead of them, we get very self-focused and we end up asking this question: who am I? Who am I? I can't even figure out how to make popcorn. Who am I? I can't figure out how to do this job. Who am I? I can't do this ministry thing that God, you're asking me to do. Thankfully, God has a response. So we see it in verse 12. And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Two things that God is doing here. Moses is saying, "Who am I?" And he's focusing on himself. The first thing that God does is he reorients Moses' focus to him. He says, "I will be with you." So that's the first thing. But the second thing that he does, he talks about the fact that when they come back, he said, "When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Do you see what he did there? God took Moses' story and he revealed that it's not actually about Moses. He revealed that the story that Moses is living is actually about God. This is mind-blowing, and it means something very, very important. And this is going to be something that sounds bad. It sounds like that's not what I want. But just trust me as we go here. Your story is not your story. Your story doesn't belong to you. This is something that our culture has a really hard time wrapping our minds around, because we hear all the time, your story is yours. You are the author. You get to decide. You can be whatever you want to be if you just put your mind to it. All of those things. And then we're confronted with parts of our story that we don't know what to do with, parts that are embarrassing, parts that are difficult, parts that are confusing, parts that are not what we would choose, whatever it is. Or maybe we really screwed something up in an epic way, and that's not how we, originally planned for things to go. This happens all the time, but this is a really liberating truth to wrap our hearts around, that our story isn't actually our story. It's God's story. You're not the author. You're more like a character because God himself is the author. In fact, it even goes beyond that. My job is not to figure out how the events of my life make sense in some kind of chronological order. It's actually not my job. It's not my job to get the whole thing figured out because I don't have the wisdom to figure it out. I don't know how it all falls into place. All I know is what's going on and how I manage my human response to it all. So if that's not my job, what is my job? It's this. We need to trust the author whose job it is to make sense of everything. And sometimes from birth to death, it's not always going to make sense in that short a time frame because the story that God is putting together about himself is a lot longer than just our lives. So we have to trust the author of the story. Everything that we're in, small moments, big moments, whatever it is, we got to trust the author. How do we know we can? Well, one very simple factor. He wrote himself into the story, right? God wrote himself into the story. He wrote himself in the form of Jesus. And so we know that because he did that and he took upon himself all of the penalty for all the terrible things that we have done, all the horrible things that we have thought and said, the ways that we have treated each other, and all of our brokenness and the ways that we fall short, he's taken all of that on his shoulders and paid for it all. Because of that, we know we can trust the author. The author suffered in the context of his own story in the greatest way possible. So if that's the case, then there can't be anything that happens to me or anything that I do or anything that, goes wrong that he can't find a way to fit in the story. And that's a really difficult truth, but I really believe it's true. So our stories don't belong to us, right? We're not the authors. God's the author. It's a story about him, but we have a very important role to play in that, and it's this. It's our responsibility to manage our part of the story, to manage it, to live in a way that glorifies him. So we're also in charge of distribution, right? God has placed us in charge of that it's our job to tell the story, to actually go out there and to share with other people in a way that he can use it for their benefit. That's an incredible responsibility. And by the way, we shouldn't be just out there telling everybody everything. That's not the job, because there are some people who don't have the maturity to handle some of the more intricate parts of your story. So if that's the case, then that means that we need to, with discerning wisdom, figure out when we distribute our story or our part of his story so that he can use it. The only stories that God can't use are the ones that we don't tell. And when we don't tell our story at all, we actually rob the author of his rights. It's his story. So be unafraid. Go out there, live, be fearless, even though you feel fear. Do stuff, try things. You're gonna fail sometimes. Burn popcorn sometimes. And when you do, give it to the Lord. Recognize that it's his story above all, so that we're not so focused on ourselves and we can be focused on him, and then tell the story. It's a very, very important thing in this day and age for us to do. Because when you are surrendered to Jesus, it's his story anyway. And that's the beautiful thing. Until next time.